Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Mike Quaranta with the Delaware State Chamber of Commerce, and thanks for joining our webinar today. Let me first promote some upcoming events that we have going on here at the Chamber. We've got our Small Business Day occurring next week on May 12th and May 13th. Whoops, a little too far there. All right, there we go. May 12th and May 13th. And that's really important, and we certainly appreciate your joining in on that as we communicate with members of the General Assembly some of our priority issues and react to some of the things that they're making decisions on as they move toward the last few weeks of session. Of course, they conclude at the end of June. Speaking of June, we have our end of session brunch. That'll be on June 8th, and of course, we'll hear from the Speaker, we'll hear from the Senate President, about their plans on what we think or what they believe will be the priorities that will get addressed before the end of session. So with that, let's get into the meat of the subject today. We're very interested to hear from our speakers. And I want to just state for the record, and just so there's real clarity around this, you know, the Chamber's position has been pretty consistent on this topic, and I think it's really important for us as we kind of go forward to hear from a range of voices. We certainly know what some advocates have said in favor of recreational marijuana. And our view of this wants to be as informed as possible. So I reached out to some people who you're going to hear from today who've got some experience in this and have got a range of views that span several years, and in places where they've lived or worked or been part of policy discussions where recreational use has been the norm or been law, and they've got some informed opinions to share with us. There are, of course, several pieces to the puzzle here. There's a law enforcement piece, there's a social work piece, there's a whole number of topics. We're really going to be focused on what's the experience in the workplace, and that's really what we want to talk about today, because that's really the area of focus for the State Chamber. Okay, with that, let me introduce our panelists today. We're joined by Gary Chandler, who's the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Association of Washington Business. This is essentially the equivalent of the Delaware State Chamber of Commerce, but in the state of Washington. And Washington, of course, has had a policy on recreational marijuana for about a decade. He's a former state representative, as well as serving in his current role. We're going to hear from Kevin Sabet. Sorry, Kevin. I'm going to really get that right. He's the president and CEO of SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana. And he served in 3 different White House administrations, the Clinton, the Bush, and the Obama White House on national drug policy staff work. And then finally, Tim O'Connell. Tim is a partner at Stoll Reeves. He's an attorney who focuses on employment law. He's a chair of a utilities board, and he's received several state bar association honors and awards, and we're grateful for all 3 of those. So let's we're going to start with Kevin, and then we'll go to Tim, and then wrap up with Gary, and then we will ask a number of questions afterwards. So Kevin, who I'm grateful for his participation. He's recently authored a book. Here it is. You can find this, and Kevin will probably tell you where you can find it. A very thoughtful presentation, and in my read of it actually resulted in a couple of questions that I'll have for him later on. So Kevin, take it away, please.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to see all of you here. It's good to see NBC 10, which actually my sister worked at a number of years ago, so that's kind of neat, and some other journalists, and really a pleasure to be with the Chamber today. There's a lot of lessons we can learn. Just for some background, I served for over 2 years as the senior advisor in the Obama administration, where I advised on drug policy and helped write the president's drug control strategy. And then in 2013, I founded this group, SAM. So I don't have control of the slides, so we'll go to the next one. SAM, there we go. Can we go to the next one? This is always fun. There we go. SAM promotes an evidence-based approach to marijuana policy that prioritizes public health. We were co-founded by former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, as well as David Frum, who worked in the Bush administration. So we are essentially nonpartisan. We have affiliates in every state across the country. And we have a scientific advisory board that advises all the work that we do. Next slide. We also collaborate with multiple medical organizations, all the major medical groups, as well as the National Business Group on Health we've collaborated with in the past, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, really basing what we're doing on the science. And there's a ton of misinformation out there right now as we navigate this issue. Next slide. The marijuana, it's really important to understand that we're talking about is probably not the marijuana most people on here, may be familiar with or recognize. We're talking about it as essentially a completely different drug, a potency level that we have never seen before. Next slide. So when people, think about marijuana, they think of this. Next slide. They do not think of this, which is essentially the edibles, the cookies, candies, sodas, gummies, lollipops, those things that are, and you can go to the next slide as well. Those things that have become very, very potent. When you look at the potency, how marijuana has been genetically bred to be increasing the potency and the strength. The research on that increased potency marijuana, there isn't a lot of it. The research we have, which is bad enough in terms of what it does to the body and the brain, is really on medium and low grade marijuana, not on today's high potency marijuana. Next slide. So the kinds of marijuana people are consuming can be up to 99% THC. And some people like to say, well, isn't this just a plant? Well, today's marijuana is not just a plant. It is something a lot stronger. It's something that really we've never seen before. And this is a big worry for those of us in public health and public policy, because we've never really seen this level of marijuana before. We don't really know what it does in the medium or long term. We know that it, is responsible for over 600,000 emergency room admissions every year from people getting psychotic breaks, basically panic attacks, psychotic episodes, etc. But we don't really know about what else it's doing. Next slide. The high potency marijuana, which defined by studies as usually 15. I mean, when you say 15 or 20%, that's actually defined as high potency. That's why, imagine these concentrates. Regular users are 5 times more likely to develop psychosis, schizophrenia. There's study after study. And I think that, the American people really have gotten the message that this is harmless. And that is the message that's the opposite of what science is offering. Next slide. We're seeing, mental health, 4 times more likely to abuse, twice as more likely to develop anxiety disorders. Next slide. We are seeing the fact that the daily use amongst high school seniors is rising dramatically, even as smoking and alcohol has gone down. Next slide. You can go to the next slide as well. And we're just seeing steady increases among young people, but really among the entire population, especially the workforce population. Next slide. And that's really what I want to have a few slides about. So first of all, we know that at least 9 to 10% of full-time employees are illicit drug users. So this is beyond alcohol. This is beyond tobacco. There are studies that have looked at this. You're more likely to have worked for more employers. You're more likely to have either been fired or voluntarily left, taken an unexcused absence, and had absences of 8 days or longer, and significantly increased tardiness. So there are costs to substance abuse at the workplace and, for the workplace. And, we're looking at $81 billion a year, at least. That's usually really only looking at the opioid problem rather than everything else. If you put alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, opioids all together, it's hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that we're losing in social costs every year. Next slide. As states have legalized around the country, we are seeing huge increases since they legalized in workplace positives. And you might be thinking, well, doesn't this mean that they, used 30 days ago? Most of the time, no. Most of the time, the levels detected are closer to more recent use, maybe 1 week. We're not talking about someone who, occasionally uses, and then once a month, they used it once a month, and then they happen to be tested, 29 days later. That's a huge myth when it comes to testing, that it's like that. But marijuana continues to be the most common drug found across all workforce categories. including the federally mandated safety sensitive workforce. And I just read today that the Philadelphia mayor banned marijuana testing for all employers other than some very specific safety sensitive or police officers. And, I think that's a little bit concerning, not because we want to see people stigmatized or put in jail, but because of the cost to the employer and the fact that those people often need help. And we'll only know if they need help often if they are identified. And I think that's very important. Next slide. Employees who test positive for marijuana have more industrial accidents, more injuries, higher absenteeism rates, according to all of these studies. And these are costing employers a lot of money. So again, there are real costs. That's why, this is a really key point. I don't have a slide on this, but it's a really key point. When we talk about the revenues for marijuana legalization, which we hear about all the time, we rarely talk about the other side of the ledger, which is the cost. And, yesterday we heard in 4 years, New York State will gain $245 million from revenue. Sounds pretty good, except when you compare that to the $245 billion state budget, which is next year's budget, that's less than 0.1% in 4 years. The first year, it's not even a blip, but in 4 years, like waiting for a mature market, it's less than 0.1% of the whole budget. And there are costs. So not only is it a drop in the bucket, but there are these costs. We have to do a proper cost benefit analysis to really understand the fiscal impact and the impact of the workforce. Of course, use doesn't only affect users. It affects family members dealing with addiction, who face financial problems, legal consequences. Listen, it might be legal for you, but it's not legal to drive with it. It's not legal to be in public with it. It's not legal to be around kids with it. There are plenty of circumstances not legal in federally funded housing. It's not legal in a lot of rental units. So there are a lot of issues there. Time spent caregiving, lost productivity at work, of course, is the big one as well. Next slide. There are also a lot of lawsuits that we're seeing, and we are seeing that legalization has opened the door to lawsuits against employers. So the head of the big lobbying group to legalize normal stated that firing pot users is simply unfair. It cannot be allowed to stand. And now we're seeing a couple of states essentially outlawing pre-employment drug tests. We're seeing cities do that, and we're seeing states do that as well. Nevada has done that. On the medical marijuana side, some states are forced to pay for the employee's marijuana use. And I'm not talking about a cancer patient with 6 months to live or somebody with debilitating severe pain. I'm talking about anybody who claims that marijuana is medicine, which basically is anybody, if you want to, in terms of the definition. And now employers are being told to pay that bill. So we're just seeing unprecedented levels of problems for the workplace and for employers. It doesn't make your state more competitive. Mark mentioned the book. I appreciate it. I do have a new book out that was just is being distributed by Simon & Schuster. It was out last week, so it's brand new. It's called Smokescreen: What the Marijuana Industry Doesn't Want You to Know. I really wrote it a long time in the making. Many people who approached me, many people in states that had legal marijuana, that were the regulators, or maybe they were in charge of the labs, telling me that the marijuana being regulated is not the marijuana you think. It's not. We're seeing tons of contaminants, molds, bacteria. The state isn't picking it up. Talking about the workplace for the marijuana industry and how volatile and how dangerous it is for some people. I interviewed even drug dealers who told me that business was thriving after legalization because they can undercut the legal price and evade law enforcement. So it's really a book of those stories. Tried to make it an interesting read. You can check it out if you would like. So there's a lot more, and we have a ton more on our website about the workplace, a ton more about kids, about all kinds of issues. If you're interested, you can go to our website, learnaboutsam.org. And if you'd like to talk to me, there's my email, info, or you can also email Kevin at learnaboutsam.org. But really a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I wanted to present some issues for us to talk about, sort of set the stage here. Very happy to take questions when you'd like.
Kevin, thank you very much. Very, very interesting data that you shared. Let's go next to Tim O'Connell. Tim, so take it away. I know you've got some slides. Tim is an employment lawyer And Tim, we're interested to hear what you've got to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I look forward to it. Helena, if you get up my slides. There we go. It may be legal. They still have to pay for it. In order to pay for it, they're going to come to work. So it's a pleasure to be here today and thinking about today. You can't tell me that the Chamber didn't plan this event for Star Wars Day, May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. And I say that because that's plainly stoner humor if ever there was one. So I'm going to talk about a few specific issues arising from the employment context. What does marijuana legalization, or at least decriminalization, that's an important difference, do for your workplace drug testing policies? What about pre-employment testing, the issue Kevin kind of touched on? What does that do for your ability to control the conduct in your workforce and related to your workforce, discipline and discharge? And finally, the issue that is cutting edge that we haven't seen a great deal of, but it remains a serious issue, and that is the question of whether we have to not just tolerate it, but in fact accommodate the use of marijuana among our workers. So next slide, please. One of the important issues to remember is that while this has been a movement within the states, we still have federal law. And as of the moment, marijuana is still a controlled substance, and we still have on the books from the Reagan administration the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act in Title 41 of the United States Code. Covered employers are required to have drug policies in place that are as prescribed by that act. And as much as the states might not like it, the states can't override federal law. So if you're a covered employer, you're still required to comply with the Drug-Free Workplace Act. Essentially, that's pretty much any business contracting with the federal government above a value of, I think it's 100 grand, which is pretty minimal these days, or any recipient of federal grants has to comply with the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act. So for those employers, much of this conversation isn't relevant. You plainly still are not just entitled to, but required to control drugs in your workforce. There are a variety of other safety sensitive or similar kinds of jobs for which the same kind of drug programs are called for. I cited just as an example, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act regulations that are applicable to drivers holding commercial driver's licenses. They have to comply with a drug testing regimen. And the last thing to think about, and I don't want to suggest that this is an exclusive list, it is not. The last thing to think about is whether your employment is covered by a contractor, a relationship by contract. I know, for example, a lot of oil refineries require their contractors to all have drug-free workplaces. So some employers must have a policy. The other question is, may you have a policy? And plainly, the answer to that is still yes. This is one where you have to get down to the specifics of your state statute as to what impact on employment it may have. But clearly, you're still entitled to have a policy that discusses certainly drug use in the workplace, but also the effect of drugs or alcohol in your workplace. Do you need to review that policy once your state legalizes marijuana? Oh, absolutely. Of course you have to. You have to look at the specific language. You need to make reference to the fact that marijuana, at least as of today, remains illegal under federal law. So you want to make sure that your employees are complying with both state and federal law. But regardless of how the specific statute is enacted, you really do need to review your previous policy and make sure that it still is up to date. Next slide, please. What about drug testing? You know, as Kevin mentioned, a number of cities have already banned pre-employment drug testing, at least as to marijuana. Put the city of New York on that list. But it's still a good idea. And why? I mean, you know, frankly, you get a better quality of applicant if they know that they're going to have to go through a drug test. And there still are many drugs of abuse out there that you can screen out, notwithstanding the legalization or decriminalization of marijuana. It does have problems for a zero tolerance policy. You know, as Kevin mentioned, it may be more a myth than reality, but it is still out in the public consciousness that marijuana testing will pick up usage some period of time ago, long enough ago that you're not going to be able to make a claim of impairment. So a true zero tolerance policy applicable to a now decriminalized bill is one you're going to need to take a look at pretty closely. All right, next slide. Here's where people start getting a little antsy, because the question is, what does marijuana decriminalization or legalization do for your ability to control the impact on your workforce, you know, every day when you come into the office? Let's distinguish two things. The first is a detection of some use as opposed to a true impairment. Proving impairment for marijuana usage is more difficult than it is with alcohol, for example. Breathalyzer tests, there's nothing along those lines that quite as readily detects levels of marijuana usage. You know, my state, when we enacted the decriminalization by initiative, vote of the people, it had some presumptive levels above which you are presumed to be impaired, but testing for that is deucedly difficult, and so it's really never proven to be a particularly useful thing, certainly not in the workforce. So let's put aside someone who comes to your work so stoned that you can tell, and someone who is impaired, but talk about usage of marijuana in the workforce or pre-work that has an impact on the job. Now here, what you've got to look for are employees who are covered by a true just cause protection. Most union contracts, union collective bargaining agreements, cover their employees under a just cause standard. In some states, most public sector employment is either implicitly or explicitly protected by just cause. And lots of individual employment contracts. I know Delaware is a big state for being a corporate headquarters. Most of your higher level corporate executives have employment contracts that have some kind of just cause language in it. You're going to need to look at that. Aside from just cause, you've got just the issues of discrimination law. Kevin flashed a reference to a Massachusetts case from 2017 that treated the effect of barring someone using marijuana for medical purposes from employment. They didn't treat it as a reasonable accommodation, which we'll talk about in a few moments, but they just said that it was a violation because you were discriminating against a person because of his or her in that case, medical condition. The other one to watch out for is wrongful discharge in violation of public policy. Now that's how my state phrases it, but most states have the same kind of idea, that we're going to get around the employment at will doctrine because your firing violates public policy. And the argument that is made, and I say that because we haven't seen a lot of these cases succeed, but the argument that has been made is the people have decriminalized this, so it's therefore wrong for you to take it into your workforce. Like I say, we haven't seen many of those cases succeed, but that doesn't mean they're not being filed. And lastly, imaginative claims, invasion of privacy. There's actually a case pending in Illinois right now on that very issue, where a railroad worker, that's one of those categories covered by federal law that is required to have a drug policy in place, was found with the presence of marijuana, and as a consequence, the next step under their drug policy is that the person has to, for a period of time, be subject to observed drug testing. And the federal court in Illinois approved a class action case that having observed drug testing is an invasion of privacy. Stay tuned, we'll see what happens with that. Next slide, please. The real cutting edge here that we haven't seen a great deal of cases yet, but it's out there, and it arises from the interaction with recreational use and medical use, right? Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and most states have comparable state laws, In the area of disability discrimination or handicap discrimination, you have the obligation to more than just not discriminate against the employee. You have an affirmative obligation to undertake steps to enable the disabled employee to do the job. Now, again, this is medical use, but you got to go through this analysis if you have someone with a medical condition. Is it a recognized disability? You know, for all of us who think that California is the land of the crazies, just last week, federal court in California, applying California law, tossed one of these cases, and he tossed it largely because it was plain the judge didn't buy the alleged disability. Not making this up, it was back pain, you know, chronic back pain. And we've all heard people complaining about their bad backs, and the judge just wasn't buying it, that was sufficient. If it is a disability, is some accommodation necessary? The key word there is necessary, not just desirable. And is it reasonable? Is it reasonable for you to tolerate the use of a substance that may impair your employee's ability to do his or her job? The key in any type of accommodation analysis is that it's individualized. We can't make generalizations. We have to look at the specific employee, the specific claim, the specific use that is at issue, and it has to be interactive. We can't just assert by fiat, this is allowed and that is not. You've got to have an interactive process in dealing with the employee. We're starting to see these claims being advanced to accommodate the use of marijuana. We have not seen many of these cases get to the level of published decisions by the highest state courts, but that is the cutting edge issue to be aware of, whether you're going to have to accommodate that. This is a vibrant area. The only parting comment I can give you is pay attention to what your state law is. Next slide, please. I'm done. Pay attention to state law. The devil is in the details here. Some of the state laws that have decriminalized or legalized, and there's some distinctions there, marijuana, have explicitly carved out employment, that the decriminalization does not impact anything dealing with the workplace. Other states are to the contrary and make it clear that it does impact your employment, and probably the majority are silent about it. So this will be something we'll be dealing with for the next few years. Thanks, and I know we're having questions at the end. I'll look forward to those.
Great, thank you, Tim. Appreciate Kevin's comments. Appreciate your comments, Gary. Former state representative, now with the equivalent of our partner in Washington State. You've seen this from the time of enactment to present. We're interested to hear your remarks.
So thank you very much for asking me. And I will tell you, we rely a lot upon the former speaker, Tim McConnell. He's been our employment law for as long as I think I've been here at AWB. And he's either led it, pushed us, whatever. If we have any problems, we always run to Tim O'Connell. So it's great that Tim was able to jump on here because he's the one that covers all of what we say and do. So let me just share what AWB is. We have followed this since I've been at AWB. First in our state, I think Tim referred to this, the first initiative that was passed that started us down the pathway of marijuana in our state, legalizing of it, was a medical marijuana. That was the first initiative that was filed, I believe, by some doctors, and it was legalized. Medical marijuana was legalized to where doctors could actually dispense marijuana for medical uses. Since that time, there was a couple other initiatives that were filed that went down in defeat. There was one that was sent to the legislature, I believe in 2011 and 2012. The legislature refused to act on it. And I think a lot of that is people like Tim O'Connell and our association and other associations went in and testified against it because of the concern of what it would do with the workplace and our members being involved with it. And so it was killed. There was outside money that came back in and ran another initiative. And in that time that the legislature refused to look at it, You had City of Seattle, I believe in 2003. They basically took the legalization of it and said, it's the lowest bottom enforcement we want in our state. So basically did everything they could in the City of Seattle to not enforce marijuana usage. And I believe that the City of Tacoma, not too far after Seattle did that, Tacoma did the same thing. So you can see the popularity of the usage of marijuana starting to grow in our state among the public out there. And then the initiative was filed, and I think the initiative passed legalizing marijuana. I think it passed with about 56 or 58% of the public support of going out. So with that all said, what we did when the initiative was getting ready to file, we talked with the initiative filers and said, we want to make sure the workplace is protected and make sure that we still are able to have drug policies, zero tolerance if we wanted drug testing, as long as you leave that alone. And we could not raise, we were asked to raise money to fight the initiative, but we didn't raise very much money for that. So the initiative passed, now it comes into law. And I will tell you, Mike, you may not like this, you may have to do it, but we set up actually a cannabis committee because we started running into issues around cannabis. First issues we ran into in association is now all of a sudden it's legal. People are now growing it, they're businesses. People are now selling it, they are businesses. And they were having conflict with government. So what do businesses do? They come to business associations and say, can you help us out? I tried to refuse as much getting involved with that as I possibly could. But it comes to a point where you've got people calling you and saying, listen, are you a business association? I am a business. I have the right to join your association. So we decided to go ahead and open it up, but create a cannabis committee to work with our manufacturers and the cannabis industry and how do we work together. And actually at our one policy committee, we had a panel of manufacturers and a panel of cannabis growers talking with each other about, okay, how do we work along? Because it's here, it's not gonna go away. And so how do we work with each other and going forward? Some of the things on the cannabis industry we worked on was around smell. I will tell you that if you legalize it in your state, you'll wanna be very careful in where they're allowed to grow it. Because in our state, you could grow it anywhere unless the cities and counties could regulate it some. Some of them wanted to stay out of it until you started having pot growing operations in a neighborhood. And the smell coming off of those is horrendous. It doesn't smell like marijuana. It doesn't smell like burning alfalfa like everybody thought it would. It is a bad smell. And so there was some legislation. The legislator that took my spot in the legislature, a good friend of mine, ran a bill allowing Department of Ecology to fully regulate all odors coming from cannabis operation. We had to go in with our committee, went in and sat down with Representative Dent and said, hate to tell you this, but we're gonna fight to kill your bill. Because the last thing we want is you give an authority to our Department of Ecology to go in and start to regulate odor. And as I reminded Representative Dent, you're from the agricultural community. And once you allow Department of Ecology to regulate odor coming off of marijuana, what about your other plants that you raise, or you're a crop duster and some of the pesticides you spray stink? Now, do you want Department of Ecology, following what you did with cannabis, to go in and regulate odor? And so we were able to work with the industry where we could get the industry to go in and take care of itself, clean up its mess, and do away with odors coming off of their facilities. The other one is going back to what Tim talked a lot about, is what about the workplace? How do we control the workplace? And most of our members, first of all, as Tim alluded to, if you are a manufacturer and in your manufacturing process, you manufacture one widget that it pertains to a federal government, whether it be aerospace or anything else military-wise, you have to have zero tolerance for drug testing. Now, what did that mean after marijuana went into force? What we found out was the first time you did drug testing, Joe Smith, who was with you for 30 years, was your best machinist that you have in the place. By golly, he tested positive. But I don't want to lose him. So what do you do? And so that's what's caused some of the problems is around that. What do you do when they test positive? And it's a whole different gamut of what folks do. A lot of times they will give a second test to make sure that the first one was not flawed, so that you can do a second test of those that were tested positive. You can enforce with all your employees, telling them that we have a drug policy in place, and yes, marijuana is legal, but we have a zero tolerance in our facility, and encourage as much as you can from your employees not to partake of it. At the same time, somebody alluded, it stays in your body for a long time. So I think up to 30 days or longer, you can detect it in your body. And so the testing becomes critical that somebody that smoked it 20 days ago, it may still be detected in their body. So we have our manufacturers looked at, as Tim said, look at your policies, make sure they're up to date, what you want to do, and then come up with, when you're testing and you have employees that test positive, what is your second thing to do? What has that caused with employment? I will tell you, in a state where marijuana is legal, it is difficult, especially in law enforcement and especially in certain manufacturers. It is difficult in hiring somebody when you drug test them that they don't have marijuana in their system. So that has caused a lot of angst in hiring people because of marijuana being legal in our state. But I will tell you, I think we've all learned how to deal with it. I think one of our biggest things, and I think there were challenges, Tim, if I'm not mistaken, this year in the legislature, they keep whittling away at medical marijuana as far as what accommodations do we need to make with people that are using medical marijuana, but yet we have zero tolerance of drug usage in our workplace. And how do we work around and being able to accommodate those people that can show with the doctor's orders that they are using medical marijuana. So with that, I think that we've been able to work pretty close. I think we've been able to keep working with the legislature as they keep messing around in the area. I think we've done a fairly good job of trying to keep it where our manufacturers still have control over their workplace.
Gary, thank you. Thank you for those remarks. I appreciate that very much. So we've got a number of questions. Kevin, I'm going to start with you.
Sure.
And again, I want to remind everybody about Kevin's book, because my first question, actually, Kevin, is something that I wanted to ask you about, a reference in the book. You talked about state public health officials and governors worrying aloud about the implications of recreational uses and what they were having on their constituents. And do you think that was directly related to the potency or misuse or something else? And what was the conclusion there? I think it mentioned the governor of Massachusetts and I think a public health administrator in Kansas. What were some of the origins of their concern?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think it really depends on the person, but I think usually the potency issue is one that gets a lot of attention because people don't understand what marijuana is. I mean, I just say there's basically new marijuana and old marijuana. And if you haven't seen marijuana in the last year, you don't know what marijuana is. It's like a different drug. So I think that was a huge concern. I will say it's interesting in Delaware, you have the president of the United States from Delaware and you have the governor of Delaware, both Democrats, both against the legalization of marijuana. And they've been pressured very, very hard to be in favor. They are not in favor of it. So I don't see this happening right now in Delaware, also FYI, but I think there were some big concerns from public health officials, especially about the vaping issue and e-cigarettes that happened. You know, that was kind of the epidemic before the epidemic, was this issue of these deaths and these other critical injuries from vaping. Some of those vapes were from legal stores. They were from places that that were supposed to be regulated. So I think that's another concern that we often hear about from these officials as well. The fact that it's supposed to be regulated, and yet we're still seeing the pesticides and the issues that are coming about. By the way, I just pasted a news article because I was really interested in Gary's presentation and the issue of smell, and that, which is a very big issue. This is from Michigan, about the smell, you know, bothering some local businesses and it being a big issue for businesses. So this is definitely something that's going to be coming up again and again.
Kevin, thank you for that. Tim, let me go to you. I'm assuming that many of your clients are, you may be connected to the HR person within your client base. And are we seeing a number of one-off cases, or kind of what I'm trying to get clear here, and I'm going to ask Gary to comment about this as well. There are a number of worries that employers have expressed to me and the team here. Are they well-founded? Have you seen the rate of cases go up? Is it pretty just steady? I don't want to add to any hyperbole. I don't want to demagogue. I just want to be accurate. So what are some of the what's the rate, the pace of your practice growth, and or what are there any common elements that you see that might be trends that you've seen over the last 10 years?
Sure. No, that is a great question, Mike, because it is easy to get alarmed about this, but let's look at what the actual facts are. And I think the impact has been somewhat diverse. If you look at a workforce that has just cause protections written into it, unionized workforces, as I say, most public sector where you have a property right and continued employment, where a just cause protection is either explicit or implicit. There we've seen a real big change. You know, when I started practice a few years before the Reagan administration implemented the Drug-Free Workplace Act. So I was a baby lawyer when that statute was enacted. And so this has been part of my practice for decades now. And it used to be that when you had a random test and someone came positive for marijuana use, that was a real easy case, even under a just cause standard. Now, not so much. If you have someone who is caught in a random test or a post-accident test and has some level of marijuana detected as a resulting blood test, typically, it's not a disqualifier. Those cases those cases used to be easy. They are not easy anymore. Take it the next step, though, and that is the discrimination cases. You know, Kevin mentioned the Massachusetts case. It's a 2017 case. And in my world, that's interesting just because that's 5 years ago. And in the intervening 5 years, we have not seen a lot of those cases. As I mentioned, the California case that rejected a very wide-ranging case in the terms of the number of theories advanced, that was just last week. So we have not seen a lot of these cases get very far. One of my partners actually litigated a case to our state Supreme Court. Now, this was under the medical marijuana statute. It wasn't under the current recreational decriminalization, the Roe case. And we won that case, actually fairly handily. And the Washington State Supreme Court is no conservative body. It's a fairly, admittedly by one of the members in an interview, admitted it's a fairly left of center court. But we won that case fairly handily, 7-2. So that was rejected. A couple of years after that, the Colorado Supreme Court with Washington, we were the first 2 states to go to full legalization. They rejected a claim that marijuana would come within the ambit of the lawful use statute. I don't know if Delaware has such a statute. Many states do. States that prescribe employers from taking action against their employees for lawful activities. Colorado rejected the claim that marijuana came under that. You know, typically it's applied to smoking, political activities. Colorado rejected that claim because marijuana remains unlawful under federal law. So these cases are out there. The accommodation cases are the ones that concern me the most analytically. But you know, the sky hasn't fallen yet, but that's because we've done a lot of work at the front end to make sure that employers have policies that are compliant with the law.
Interesting. All right, Gary, we just talked about this with Tim. You know, so it's been about 10 years since public policy changed in Washington State. Have you seen any evidence of challenges that employers have had with recruitment, hiring, retention? Tim's talked about some of the dismissal issues that come and end up in the courts. But what's been the experience? Is this are a lot of the concerns expressed by the business community unfounded, or what are the pieces of it that are maybe overstated, and what are the pieces that are maybe that don't get enough attention?
So because I can see Tim O'Connell, and I can see if he frowns or starts to shake his head and put it down when I say something, I'll know if I went too far. 2 things I want to come back to is Kevin talked about the smell. We worked with the industry to where they can incorporate in their manufacturing a misting system to take care of the odor coming out of their facilities. It was hard to work with that industry and getting them to go there until I personally went to one in my backyard in Moses Lake where I live and told them I have a letter from the school district going to the city to ban your operation because you're within a half a mile of a school district or a school. And the school is having to take the kids in at times because of the odor coming off your facility. First, he refused to let me in the place until he talked with some folks that invested in the place, and they said, you better listen to Gary. So we sat down and worked with them, and we're able to take care of odor problems coming off of these facilities. The second is that I would have to say, well, the second piece I forgot to mention was Kevin also hit on this, is our state now, revenue-wise, and you're right in a way, Kevin, we're at a $50 billion budget. We're now about $1.2 billion, $1.4 billion in revenue coming off of marijuana. And it continues to just climb. As I've asked the state economists, where's all this money coming from? Who's smoking all this stuff? And he looked squarely at me and he said, your generation. It's now become legal. Back when you were in high school and college, you may have not used it back then, but now all of a sudden, or you may have used it back then, now all of a sudden it's come back around to where you're saying, oh, wait a minute, it's legal. Let me go back and try that.
Right. And actually, that's a good point. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the emergency room mentions, because it's people that have not used it thinking it was what it was 30 years ago. And they're actually the ones having the problem. The other place it's coming from, regardless of age, is mainly from the heavy users. So when you look at the majority of the revenue, just like with alcohol, it's 20% of people consume 80% of the product. And so that is obviously a huge dynamic to understand too. Sorry, I just wanted to add that, Gary.
No, I think, and you're right, Kevin. I think the other thing that's interesting, the black market in Washington State has not dried up. Even with the heavy taxation, I think it's like 37% taxation.
Yeah, that's
The black
probably
market-
why.
The black market is still alive.
Thriving. Yeah, I know.
And our revenues continue to climb the
Yeah.
way they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other place,
yeah.
as far as employment, I would agree with where Tim is that we have not seen the sky fall as we thought it would.
Mhm.
I think that our employers had good policies in place, went back and re-looked at their policies and made sure, working with people like Tim, made sure their policies were accurate and that they could defend those. And they've been able to work around it. As I said, hiring is a challenge because a part of your testing and stuff is a drug test. Then it washes out probably 30 to 40% of your people that you are trying to hire. So there is a large washout rate. And I know I used to be a police officer, and I know talking with my following police department that I was part of, they have a washout rate of about 60% applicants wanting to become police officers because of drug testing. So it does have that effect when you're going to hire. You're going to have a lot more dropout rate because of that drug testing. Now, some of them are incorporating in a second test to make sure that the first test was not flawed. But there is a lot of problems and concerns around the hiring because people, the usage of it. Tim, were you going to correct me?
No, Gary, I'm not going to correct you. I'm going to add on to one thing you say, and let me make an interesting, what I think is an interesting observation. As I said, we haven't seen a ton of these cases nationwide, but when you look at the cases that actually get filed and you kind of dig into the facts, you see one recurring fact pattern, particularly on these cases where it's early on in the employment, one recurring fact pattern, that is that the applicant didn't know that he or she was going to have to take a drug test and comes to work on the first day and says, here's the little bottle and there's the room. And, they're alarmed because they know they're going to fail. And I submit that to you because that is a recurring fact pattern. People didn't know they were going to be tested and walked into an employment situation where they're going to be tested. It's all the more reason that if you're going to have a drug screen, publicize it. Make sure your applicants know, because if you do that, you get a better class of applicants. Even if we can't drug test in New York City for marijuana anymore, we can still screen out the meth heads. And that's something that's worthwhile in and of itself.
Let me, Kevin, let me go back to you for a second. And I mentioned this to the bill sponsor here. I've had some good conversations with Representative Osinski. Unlike alcohol, there is no such device called a breathalyzer as there is for alcohol. And 0.08 means something in the medical community, whether you are like me, right. I'm 6'2" and 185 pounds, or whether you are, let's say, a female of 5'1" and 120 pounds. But 0.08 is 0.08. The medical community has said that is impairment. Where are we with devices? And if you even had a device, is the medical community in a position where somebody can interpret whatever the data would be?
Yeah. So I don't think we're ever going to get to a true level of impairment for marijuana because THC is absorbed very differently than alcohol. It affects people very differently, including regular users versus non-regular users and obviously size and everything like that. And so I think we can pretend that we have a level. So there are states that say, 5 nanograms per milliliter or whatever, is impairment for driving, but it's not a true measure of impairment. And we don't have a breathalyzer type thing right now, although we keep getting promised this. I always hear every year a new startup doing it, and I hope it succeeds. There's always some exciting news articles about it, but I haven't seen anything really come to fruition and be used and reliable enough. So I'm very skeptical of that. The studies are all over the place on this. We have studies showing that if you used a week ago, you can still show impairment even after you're not high anymore for like 3 or 4 days. We have other studies showing for regular users are not as impaired, even if they're using a lot of marijuana. It's very difficult. So you're going to need to have the testing, I think, for driving, at least testing with other kinds of behavioral type of tests, like, you know, walking on the sidewalk in a straight line, that kind of thing in your eyes, because we're never going to get I don't think we're ever going to get a true biomarker.
And if I may, I know I tried to find out how far along our Washington State Patrol is. I know that our State Patrol has been working very closely with Colorado and with University of Washington on trying to come up with that standard. But I think, like Kevin said, it's hard to do that. And it was interesting that even in the initiative that passed, they tried to put levels in there, but I think those were pie in the sky to make it to the public, hey, we're going to control, like alcohol, your levels and stuff. So I think they put that in there as more as to the public, hey, we're going to be able to watch and make sure that people aren't impaired. But those numbers that they put in there, I haven't heard from anybody that they mean anything other than maybe some way to sell it to the public. But I tried to get back with the State Patrol and ask them. I did not get a hold of anybody at the University of Washington. They told me that they're getting closer on trying to come up with some impairment standards around it for influence while you're driving, but they couldn't really give me. They're hoping within the next couple years still. I mean, they've been doing this for a long time. So it kind of comes back to where Kevin is saying. I think marijuana is one of those things, somewhat like alcohol. You can take my wife that never drinks, had one glass of dessert wine, and she loved it so well, she started on her second one. And I said, whoa, Deb, be careful. Now, when she stood up, I got embarrassed. I thought I was going to have to carry her out. But that's somebody that's never drank before. So marijuana is the same way, depending on if you're somebody that uses it constantly. I think your impairment is going to be different, much the same as an alcohol. A user that uses alcohol all the time, their impairment is going to be at a different rate than somebody that has never used alcohol. So I think they're having problems with what is that impairment, and body size, body matter, and everything will matter. So I think they're a long ways away. I think the biggest thing I can tell employers is make sure, like Tim said, first of all, make sure that everybody that you're looking at hiring knows that you do drug testing. Make sure that they know here's our policies that we have if you want to go to work here, and make sure those policies are in place. And I think that's better off for them moving forward.
Tim, we've got just 2 more minutes here before the top of the hour, and let me thank all 3 of you. I'm going to let you offer a final thought, and then Kevin, you can conclude our session. Again, let me thank all 3 of you for your time and your presentations. Tim, any closing thoughts? And then Kevin.
Closing thoughts, Mike, because I know that Delaware is in the process. You're looking at the statute. This is one where I would just urge the business community to be very active, because when you're looking at it from a legal perspective, the devil is in the details. And there are good versions of these statutes out there, and there are better versions of these statutes out there, and there are some that are not so good. So this is one where you just can't turn your back on the process, because you can modify this legislation to make it more amenable to the business community as the employer that is providing the jobs that keeps your state functioning. So this is one where engagement is really a key.
Appreciate that a lot. Thanks. Kevin, any last and final thoughts?
Just that I think, you know, we can learn from what other states have done. This is a continuing changing space. I think the lawsuit issue is one. I know Tim obviously was talking about that, but I do think it's an issue we need to keep looking at, the legal issues, because there's just so many complex things. As a reminder, marijuana is against federal law. You know, we sometimes forget about that, but it's in the Controlled Substances Act. I don't see the Senate moving on this, even if Leader Schumer wants to. There are 6 or 7 Democrats in the U.S. Senate who will not go along with this. The President of the United States doesn't like it. So I don't see this changing anytime soon, meaning we're going to be in sort of this limbo for a while. And I would just say kind of what I learned when I wrote my book, Smokescreen, is, beware also of this industry in terms of the antics sometimes they are up to, who they are associating with. You'd be very surprised. This is still an illegal industry. This is illegal. I don't care what state you're in. I don't care if you're in Colorado. I don't care if you're in Texas. It's illegal. What does that mean? It attracts people that are comfortable with being in an illegal activity. Not saying that everyone in the marijuana industry is tied to a drug cartel. Of course not. A lot of them are well-meaning folks who see this as legal in their state. They don't even really understand the federal implications, and they move forward. But this is still a very, very gray area. So I would just say kind of to tread slowly.
That's great. Yes, Gary, go ahead.
Just one last comment that we haven't talked about of some of the concerns around this industry, because as Kevin said, it is still illegal with the federal government. Banking is a major issue. You cannot take your marijuana business to a bank. They will not take your money. And most all of these operations are strictly cash. And the only way you can get it in the banking system is through like a credit union or some other place that's not nationally tied. So it's a real issue around banking because it's a federal law still. And so the banking of it, there's a lot of cash out there. And wherever there's cash, well, where that leads sometimes. So.
Well, I appreciate that. We have, of course, quite a footprint in the financial services industry and banking in particular. So good last comment. So, well, let me thank all three of you again. I'm grateful for this. Again, everybody's bio is available. This session was recorded. And the contact information for all of our participants is there. Kevin, good luck with the book. Tim, good luck with the law practice. And Gary, I'm grateful for you sharing your experience in Washington State as well, and the realities of this. It's a challenging topic, and one I'm sure that we will continue to sort through as time progresses. So, thanks everybody. Have a great day, and thanks more.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for hosting this. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So long, everybody.
Bye.